of Water and the Spirit, Chapter 9 and Chapter 10. Chapter 9. The long journey begins. The cup was full. It had to be drunk, bitter as it was. The impulse to raise my hand against my superior had triggered an unstoppable flow of events, pushing me like an avalanche toward the chasm of the unknown. In retrospect, my actions seemed inevitable. Inside me was a void of rage so deep, so carefully nurtured over the past 15 years, that I could have done nothing else, finally, but respond to violence with violence. Father Joe had trapped me in my pride. I read my fate in the sepulchral faces of my classmates. In an instant, I had lost one identity and acquired another, and I felt as alone as I ever had before. Nothing could change the course of things as they stood. In a moment of excess, I had inadvertently ceased to belong to the seminary. This realization echoed in me endlessly, forecasting immense tribulations ahead. Father Joe was sitting in the dirt, trying to get up. He was grimacing like a monkey, and his white robe was pierced all over by thorns and stalks of wiregrass. A crowd was slowly gathering around him, students from the lower division next door who had heard the noise of the argument followed by the sound of breaking glass and Father Joe's cry as he fell. They were more fascinated by the spectacle of a priest wearing a formerly immaculate soutane, sitting on the dusty ground, than curious about how he had got there. Inside the classroom, the students were still standing. Their consternation seemed to have worked a paralysis on their nervous systems. I, on the other hand, felt an urgent need to end the suspense I had created by my impetuous actions. I stood there sweating, facing my dumbfounded schoolmates, my confusion rising in proportion to their apprehension. I began to speak, partly to myself to keep my blood flowing, and partly to make a show of composure. Friends, I have committed a sin of the most terrible nature, vastly worse than those we have been allowed to take to the confessional every other Friday. I do not think any priest will mediate for me in any attempt I make to seek divine forgiveness. I have attacked God by attacking his closest ally. I didn't mean to do this. I still can't believe it has happened to me. Can no one help me? I feel so alone. I wanted help from my closest friends, but I knew they couldn't offer it because there are certain limits beyond which help is impossible. I was too numb to even feel pity for myself. For a while, I stood there looking stupid. Antoine was crying, but in a rather manly fashion. He made no sounds, but I knew that the 2 lines of tears running down his cheeks were for me. I bowed my head, as if I were a bottle just emptied of its contents and made useless as a result. Words died out of me. "Where are you going?" inquired Robert in a tone that suggested that he was desperately seeking some sort of compromise. He was the first to regain his wits and was now trying to play the role of mediator. "This was just an accident. We all saw it. We'll back you up in front of Father Superior. At the worst, you'll get away with a series of minor punishments. Don't be so dramatic." Though I wanted to believe what he said, I realized there could be no mercy for anyone who attacked a priest in a seminary. Nothing like this had ever happened before at Nancy. I would be seen as a godless savage who had willfully resisted the purifying powers of this Christian institution and returned to the uncouth primitivism of his original state. "I don't know what to do," I said vaguely. My mind was racing. I suppose I should put as much distance as possible between me and this place. "Stay," cried Francois. "Hell, we're all sinners here, right?" He was looking at everybody in the classroom as if seeking agreement from them. There were murmurs of approval, or were they of disapproval? By this time, I did not care. I had run out of answers. With death in my heart, I crossed the threshold of the classroom, knowing that I would never be able to return. Meanwhile, the crowd had thickened around Father Joe. A few were helping him clean up his soutane, while others watched the procedure piously, arms folded. Was the presence of all these witnesses the reason he didn't leap back in through the window to kill me? No one seemed to notice my departure. The classroom was less than 50 meters from the latrines, which were built a few meters from the outer rim of the seminary. Beyond the latrines was a semi-jungle of trees and tall grass, easy to disappear into it. Every step toward the wild outer rim of the seminary seemed like a step toward doom, dragging me backward in time. In front of me was the infinite green mystery of the jungle, speaking a language I could not decipher. Behind was the sealed door of a haven of security and protection that had suddenly been transformed into an inimical alien world. My first taste of freedom made me wish that I had never wanted to be free. I was frightened by the immensity of the jungle, its silent and cold invitation. Now that I had the opportunity to respond to the longing to go home, had I lost faith all of a sudden? Was I fearful because, for the first time in 16 years, I was expected to make my own decisions about what to do and where to go for the rest of my life? If I had gambled on the odds and stayed in the seminary, I asked myself, wouldn't that have been better than my present mess? Surely my classmates and Father Michael would have supported me. I felt stupid for having acted in haste. I felt angry at myself for attacking a priest and leaving without being asked to. But even if I could return, what would I say? To have nothing to do and no one to answer to is a frightening thing. Here I was, facing the world and yet incapable of assuming my own freedom. When I finally moved on, it was only because I heard voices behind me. Without thinking, I walked into the jungle to avoid being seen. Thus, I began my voyage home. All I knew was that home was east. How far east? I could not tell. The jungle was not too dense, and I could see reasonably far ahead of me. The late morning sun was ablaze in the savanna blue sky, promising great heat. I walked steadily eastward, as if trying to complete one of those assignments we were given in the seminary every morning before 8 o'clock, which we had to do without any thought. Here and there, unrecognizable natural sounds reminded me of the precariousness of my situation. Images of the comforts left behind me rushed through my mind. The quiet orange groves and banana plantations of the seminary, the arrays of flowers on either side of its meditation trails, the comforting thought of a meal always at hand whenever one was hungry, and the security of a bed to rest on when one was tired. Why had I ever left? What could possibly replace the life I had grown accustomed to over the last 16 years? I felt like a domesticated beast abruptly released into the jungle. I had lost my vital instincts, but I decided as long as the sun was up there bright and hot and I could still see where I was going, I would keep moving. My white seminarian shirt was soon soaked with sweat. The forest was still, as if petrified by the heat of the flaming sun. This deep silence created something like a vacuum inside me, filling me with images of a new world about to be created the split second I became aware of it. I was thirsty. Maybe I was seeing things. The sound of an insect broke the trance of suspense I was walking in and brought me back to the stark reality of my desertion. As the sun traveled down the vast blue sky toward the horizon, I came to a wide open dirt road. Judging by the position of the sun and the direction of my own shadow, it ran east-west. I walked along the edge of it until the sound of an engine caught my attention. Far behind me, I could see a huge cloud of red dust, indicating that the vehicle was a truck. If it was one of the huge trucks used to bring supplies to the seminary, it would probably be piloted by one of the priests. The thought of being seen sent a chill through me that ran like lightning down my spine. I instinctively hid myself behind a tree and waited for the truck to pass. Soon I could see the driver busy at the wheel, trying to keep the huge machine straight and avoid the holes and heaps of sand that crowded the highway. Though I did not know his name, I saw that he was a priest. Seated next to him was Blaze, the cook. They were probably on their way to the nearest supply center. How far could that be? I wondered. Were there a lot of people there? Could I get there before sunset? The truck roared past me, covering my white uniform with red dust. For a while, I could see nothing. Up ahead, I heard the engine wail and groan and emit a series of frightening explosions. Then its noise receded rapidly. The heavy silence of the bush was restored. I resumed my journey, hoping that at least this road would take me to an inhabited place where I could get some information about my whereabouts. To avoid the thick dust, I moved to a trail that ran parallel to the highway and that kept it carefully in sight. I walked, aware of nothing but the unspecifiable distance I was covering, till the sun disappeared behind a far mountain. The narrow trail I was following became faint, then almost invisible in the twilight. Countless sounds came from everywhere, welcoming the fall of the dew, and my shoes became progressively wetter as I walked. The coolness that evening brought seemed to have an invigorating effect on the jungle. Its moisture awoke thousands of insects that became noisier the darker it got. I realized that I had walked a whole day without eating. My mind was so crowded by thoughts, my body so stiff and soaked with sweat, that I could not even think about what I was going to do when complete darkness fell and I had to sleep. Very soon, it became impossible to go any farther. The night was dark as charcoal. I felt as if I were walking with my eyes tightly closed. The crisis that had provided the impetus to keep moving all day was far behind me now. My motivation to keep going was being undermined by hunger, fear, loneliness, and a desolate sense of homelessness. I had to gain a sense of direction and control. Two things were becoming more important than anything else: food and rest. But for a person accustomed since birth to having these needs met by other people, it was not natural to think creatively about how to obtain them for oneself. In the seminary, when one felt hunger, there was always the guarantee of a meal within the next hour or so. After all these years, my system was like a clock that would register hunger shortly after morning mass, then later after the Angelus at noontime, and in the evening prior to Vespers. But these were sweet triggers because the food was always there. Imagining the good meals I had enjoyed at the refectory only worsened the experience and enhanced the fear I was beginning to feel. What was I supposed to do with this fear? What was I supposed to do with my hunger and thirst? While I walked, I thought about food. It was getting harder and harder to move my body. Each step was beginning to require all my attention, and my progress had slowed dramatically since dark. I finally decided that the need for rest was more urgent than the desire for food and more easily available. I quickly filled my arms with some fresh leaves from the dwarf trees I walked past and soon had enough of them to make a bed. Big trees were everywhere. I picked the closest, dropped my leaves beneath it, and sat on them with my back against the trunk and my legs outstretched. At that moment, I felt all the weight of stress and fear and exhaustion register in my body in a way that nailed me stiff where I was. I tried to stay awake a while longer to sort out some of my most urgent thoughts, but sleep was coming upon me fast. Fleetingly, I wondered how safe I was at night in the middle of the bush. An immense bird was flying toward me from the south. Its wings were spread very wide on either side of its slender, muscular body, and it prepared to land on me. The movement of its wings produced a fan-like wind that quickly chilled my body. My first thought was to somehow hide on the other side of the tree to avoid being hurt by this huge and frightening creature that had erupted out of nowhere, but I could not move. I had lost control of my senses. My mind was still operating, but my body had ceased to be connected to it. The bird grasped me by the shoulders and emitted a shrieking noise as it took off with me hanging underneath. It was so dark I could not tell where I was being taken to, but I knew we were covering a great distance. Then, as if by enchantment, all of this vanished, and I found myself sitting on a soft, hairy body that somehow felt very familiar. To make sure it was a body, I ran my hand up and down it and pulled out some hair. I also felt as if a wet sponge were being applied to my face and that my body was producing a cool sensation. I could feel myself sleeping, yet I had no power to open my eyes to see what was going on. I felt no fear and no sense of hurry. The sensation of being taken care of canceled out every instinct to try and find out what was really happening to me. I heard voices, or was it just a voice? I did not understand what it was saying, but it spoke for a very long time, as if reciting some discourse in an obscure language. The strangeness of the language did not frighten me. Nothing in the tone of the voice did. Asleep or awake, I could feel myself profoundly participating in the restoration of my fatigued body, as if I were a hungry person imbibing a good meal. I was enjoying the experience, and I liked the homey sensations it generated. I had buried the hardships of the day in an experience that, though strange, was comforting. When I woke up, it was almost dawn, and the sun's rays were trekking across the skies. I did not know where I was until I tried to move and found out I was sore all over. It was then that the memory of the dream rushed back into me with great clarity. I looked about as if remembering something I just finished doing. Scattered all around and over me were soft feathers mixed with hair. The tree under which I had slept had been freshly scratched by something large, as if someone had battered the trunk with a powerful tool. In some places, the bark had been peeled off, leaving fresh, gaping wounds on the trunk. I stood up and stretched, feeling my muscles ache with the pain of my long march away from the seminary. It had been an agitated night. I could scarcely believe I had had such incoherent and hallucinatory dreams. They were the kinds of images that come to one as an expression of excessive fatigue. But had something real also happened? I could not explain the presence of the feathers and the hair on the ground all around me. What about the bird that had flown away with me, and the hairy thing that had touched me as if it knew me? In spite of my initial fear, I remembered comfort, the kind of comfort that puts the mind to rest from its torments. In a very real way, I was still drawing support from the dream, as if a powerful, nurturing presence lingered nearby. I convinced myself that something good was following me, looking out for me, that an ungraspable force was expressing itself around me. Maybe it had always been there, but I had not been able to perceive it because too much had been distracting me in my old life. The incident presented me with a great puzzle, but the puzzle did not feel like a challenge. To resolve it, I felt I had only to stick with my commitment to keep going amid the silence of the tropical flora and the deep mystery of its bosom. Thoughts of my home reminded me of the horrendous reality of my situation. I was lost, sandwiched between a past that had utterly forgotten me and a future that was undecided. I arose and began to walk toward the rising sun. The fresh air of the morning was powerful, but it reminded me of my hunger. If only I could eat something, I thought over and over. My mouth felt as if it were plastered with a layer of sticky substance I could not get rid of. I kept thinking of a good toothbrush and some sweet Colgate toothpaste. But where in the jungle could I find the running water that is so important for brushing your teeth? Then I remembered that my father used to have a fresh twig stuck in his mouth when he was not eating. His constant chewing of it obliged him to spit frequently. What tree was it whose branch he used as a toothbrush? I decided to try out some fresh twigs just to see how they would work. By this time, the sun had risen behind the tall trees. Its rays sporadically stole through their foliage, coloring the forest with enigmatic patterns of light and dark. The trees around me were getting thicker and thicker. Their leafy branches gave me a canopy of cool darkness. The grass was getting rarer and rarer. I found a small tree and broke off one of its branches, revealing a whitish interior. I sliced the upper part away and kept a short piece. At first, chewing was hard, and the wood tasted bitter. But the bitterness was better than my sticky mouth. The more I chewed, the more watery my mouth turned, and I swallowed every bit of it. I was uncertain about whether I was going the right way, yet I didn't have any better ideas. In front of me, I noticed a tree loaded with fruits that looked like oranges. Their bright color exerted a powerful attraction, but I found out that they were either inedible or not yet ripe. They were very sour and resisted every bite. The sight of a fruit tree alleviated my panic somewhat, however, reminding me that I was, after all, in the bush, where natural food was plentiful. I began to look harder and harder as I walked. Almost one tree out of 10 carried some fruits, but most hung high above my head, defying my curiosity and my hunger that, seeing the possibility of fulfillment, raged more and more inside of me. Fully occupied with my hunger, I had discontinued dwelling on my fate. I began to feel like it was perfectly natural to be out there in the middle of nowhere trying to go somewhere. Is this the first sweet taste of freedom? I thought back to the seminary, now lost in the jungle far behind me. Looking at my wristwatch, I saw that it was 7:45. I imagined the mechanical operation of hundreds of lives as they listened to the end of the morning mass. They were all thinking about the warm rice porridge waiting for them at breakfast. But before they could eat, they would have to go through physical training, a time most of us despised. My progress slowed as I moved into the mountains. As I reached the top of the first one, I realized I was close to a town. The setting sun was shedding its light on countless roofs, which reflected back into my eyes, making it too bright for me to see anything distinctly. But the town was definitely there, a few kilometers down in front of me. The reddish thread of another dirt highway, bisecting the one I was following, glowed to the north. It too was going toward the rows of shining tin roofs in the middle of the valley. When I reached the edge of town, it was almost dark. The houses looked miserable and small. It was a suburban shantytown. I was exhausted, dusty, and desperate to know my whereabouts. This town was very different from anything I had seen before. First of all, there were no nearby farms. The town was full of streets, and each street was lined with houses, one next to the other. In every direction, people were walking or driving or riding bicycles or mopeds. People walked in groups most of the time, groups that paid little attention to one another. I was anonymous. Nobody cared who I was. In a sense, it was comforting not to be asked questions, not to be exposed as a deserter from the divine. I was invisible as long as I looked like everybody else. The road that had taken me into town had become a dirt street, then a paved street that ended in a square where several streets met. On the far side of the square was a street that went east. There was no sidewalk alongside it, just dirt covered with scattered city debris, some of it hidden in the grass. The stench of human excrement and other rotting things filled the evening air. Soon I was walking under tall trees that lined a paved street, straight and dark. As I walked, my path was lighted by the asterisk glare obscure asterisks diffused by courtyard lamps from the rows of dwellings. Everywhere around me there was life. Now and then I heard sounds coming from the houses. The cry of a baby followed by the appeasing voice of its mother, the cries of children playing in a courtyard, and the voices of men assured me that there were other human presences around me, even though they spoke in a tribal language I didn't know. In another house, a radio blasted local music so loudly that I wondered how anyone could hear anyone else. I did not realize I was the only person walking in that area until I reached another part of the street illuminated by neon lights and encountered other pedestrians. They were young people, tough looking and too preoccupied with their business to notice me. They spoke French. Taking a deep breath, I hurled a swift bonsoir at four men walking in a group as I was about to pass them. They looked up briefly and returned the greeting. I asked what town it was. They stopped and looked at me with interest. I cleared my throat and asked again, "What's the name of this town?" One of them answered, "You mean this part of Bobo? It's Owazenville, man." Where are you going? I'm going to Darno. That's far away. The station is up the street. What station? Where people take the transport to go to that part of the world. You mean there is a bus to Darno tonight? I don't know, but somebody at the East Station will tell you if there are any departures tonight. How far is the station? Just another half a dozen blocks past the Lycée Alazin. I thanked the man and walked away. This town is Bobo, I thought. On the map, it is nearly 100 kilometers from the seminary. I had walked all that distance in about 2 days. There was a bus station too. I was delighted by the possibility of having a ride home. The bus station was an open dirt space where buses, cars, vans, pickups, and trucks were parked. Even though there was a street light, the moonlight dominated the area, giving indistinguishable shapes to the people. At one of the corners of the station, there was an open-air restaurant, something like a grill. A woman was selling rice and fried fish, while a man was busy grilling meat. Scattered around the area were men and women in transit. I asked the man at the grill, "Where is the bus to Darno?" The man replied in a tribal language I did not understand, but he seemed to have understood my question, which was posed in French. He pointed to a nearby truck. A tough-looking man was loading fat burlap sacks, probably full of millet. The cargo area of the truck was made of wood and steel. It did not have a roof, but a metal structure arched over it that looked like it could be covered with canvas. One man was standing in the truck while the other stood on the ground, hurling merchandise up to him with split-second timing. I waited until they stopped to ask if the truck was going to Darno. The man on the ground nodded and added, "We will leave as soon as the truck's full. It's 500 francs for the trip. I don't have the money, but I want to go home. Then go borrow it quick before we leave. I'm new here. I don't know anybody." "That's none of my business. If you have 500 francs, you get in and you go. If you don't, go find it first." I found a place where they cooked meat over an open fire. People sat on stones with their feet in the mud while they ate. They came and left in groups, speaking loudly in a mixture of poor French and local dialects that kept changing as the groups changed. They laughed abundantly. The food was so blackened by the fire that I wondered how they knew what they were eating. No one paid any attention to me. I liked that. In an odd way, the proximity of people felt reassuring. They were present, yet absent, and they probably experienced me in the same way. Chapter 10. The Voyage Home. Since I had no way to get 500 francs, I had no choice but to keep going on foot. But that did not seem so unpleasant, for in these circumstances one does not think of distance or speed when facing a journey. The focus is on the process. There are stories in my village about people walking all the way to the Ivory Coast or to Ghana during the first half of the century when the French decided to use unpaid indigenous labor to construct railroads. As a young man, my father had participated in the construction of the railroad, the one designed to link the jungle to the desert, but never made it to the yellow sands of the Sahara. He had stories of interminable walks through the savannah and the jungle, heading toward the ocean. By order of the colonial commandant, people were requisitioned by the village chief and packed into the administration warehouse before being sent northward on foot. The journey, which lasted about a month, remained in the memories of those who made it as the most physically demanding and mentally demoralizing experience of their lives. Almost all who were requisitioned were used as bearers. Those not loaded with goods were in charge of providing the impetus for this human locomotive so that it could proceed at an acceptable speed. Overseers had whips to lash the travelers and keep them walking fast and steady. Those who could not endure succumbed on the road, where their carcasses were abandoned to the vultures, hyenas, boars, and lions. Stories like this were common. They testified to the challenges of the new time, the white man's time in the African realm. Mine was a much different experience from that of the people who had preceded me. I did not have any baggage and was therefore lighter than the lightest. When I took to the bush, walking along the dirt highway going east, I had all the time in the world to waste. The landscape around me was beautiful because of its diversity. The succession of mountains and valleys added to the panoramic aspect of the place. There was a creek or a river in every valley I crossed. The unpolluted water was refreshing to drink. The abundance of fruit trees saved me from my fear of starvation. I had gotten used to living in the bush as a good deserter of God, but my spirit did not want to forget. It acted as a counterforce to my motion forward and produced in me the feeling of someone running away because he was too guilty to be forgiven. I could see with my mind's eye what would have happened had I decided to stay. The total character thrashing, the gossip, the whip, the isolation, and the unhealable wound to my soul. Things would never have been the same again. Were they the same presently? No one could live so many years in such a strict institution and leave it unhaunted. I felt the seminary following me, judging me, slowing me down, wanting me back, and accusing me of violating the physical integrity of one of its sacred members. Images rushed into my crowded consciousness with insistent clarity. The bearded face of Father Malat appeared and looked down on me as he wondered how to save a soul as messed up as this. Then Father Superior's stentorian voice invaded my ears within. He wanted me to take the punishment as a man totally committed to the divine. He wanted me to submit as an example and be corrected in a way that would also set an example. I heard myself singing requiem songs in a weeping tone. It was a cacophony of arguments launched in every direction within my consciousness. How I was able to keep going forward, I could not tell. My first night in the mountains, I slept well because I did not dream. But when I woke up, I regretted being awake because what visited my conscious mind was the unending problem with guilt. I felt sandwiched between worlds, going toward the one my village that had abandoned me, to the other, now haunting me as if a good confession would have set things straight. As I walked with the heaviest baggage of thoughts ever, I could hear the agonizing sounds of trucks trying to conquer the unforgiving dirt highway. My anxious ruminations ended when I arrived at a village at a crossroad. The new road went north-south, and I wondered if it was the same road that I had seen from the top of the mountain. There were people everywhere. I noticed a man at a gas station. "Which road is this?" I asked in French. The man stared at me, then said, "We first greet people in this corner of the country before asking questions. The new era has not changed the rule yet." This was spoken patronizingly in passable French. The man was filthy. He seemed to be an extension of the oil and grease he sold. He was perspiring profusely, even though the weather wasn't that hot, probably because he was so fat. The shirt he wore had once been white. I apologized for being so informal and greeted him again politely in French. He pointed south, saying, "This road goes very far. If you stay on it, it will take you into Ghana. The other direction west goes into Bobo, and if you stay on it, it will take you into Mali. The road that goes into Ghana ends down there into the real Bobo Road, the road that goes also to Ouagadougou." He pointed his finger northward. Then he asked sarcastically, "Now, what do you want?" "I want to go to Dano," I said, assuming that his knowledge of roads included cities and towns. The man looked astonished or embarrassed. I couldn't tell which. "You see this road?" he said, pointing south. "Take it and go very far, then ask someone. I think that this Dano place must be a savage region hidden from the light of history. I don't remember seeing it in any book." He returned to his work as if he wanted nothing else to do with me. I knew that my village was close to Ghana, so I resumed my voyage, even though my mind could not stop asking, how far is very far? The highway was heavily traveled. Every time a truck, a car, or a horse cart passed, it was followed by a thick cloud of red dust that stuck greedily to the body, whether there was moisture on it or not. To avoid choking, I tried to stay as far away as possible from the highway, but I could never seem to get far enough. That, I soon learned, was because I was on the wrong side of it. The dust never blew to the other side. For 3 days and 4 nights, I encountered no village, only my thoughts and feelings mixed together in fierce competition. I saw birds, rabbits, monkeys, and antelope. Antelope were likely to be found in the middle of the afternoon at water holes. As we drank together, they looked at me with astonishment. When I walked away, they continued drinking as if they had determined I was not a hunter. Monkeys didn't seem surprised by me at all. Some of them traveled alongside me, jumping from branch to branch and screaming to one another until they lost interest in me. Rabbits fled in silent disarray. As I walked closer and closer to my past, I didn't feel excitement. Instead, countless grim questions lashed out at me. What if everyone is dead? What if the house you seek never was? What do you think you're going to do anyway? On the fourth day of my journey along this road, I came to a town where most of the houses were made of mud. Farther ahead, I could see the tower of a church. This is how far I was supposed to walk before asking someone for Dano, I thought. I was told that the name of this town was Dibogu. Dano was under its jurisdiction and located 55 kilometers to the north. The man I spoke to didn't seem interested in knowing anything about me, nor was he in the mood to talk. But for the first time, someone had actually given me a firm location for the town where I was born. 50 kilometers felt like a day's walk. My heart pounded in my chest. Did I feel this excitement because I was going home at last? Or was it because I was close to an ending? There was no definitive answer. The last part of my journey was almost twice the speed of the first part. I counted my steps 10 at a time until I reached 100, then started all over again until I lost the energy to do that. Farther east, I encountered another crossroad. This one was marked. There was a sign that said Dano was north from where I was. I arrived at a marketplace where an immense crowd was bartering. I sat underneath a tree to catch my breath. The day was only two-thirds over, so I didn't think I was running out of time. After all, wasn't I home? Nobody had confirmed it yet, but I thought I remembered the marketplace and the huge kapok trees lining the dirt road that ran through it. A man came over to me and said something I didn't understand. I tried to respond, but I had forgotten which language I was speaking. What came out of my mouth was gibberish. I was exhausted, so I closed my eyes and slept, but not for long. When I woke up, there was a crowd around me. Everybody was talking at the same time in a language I didn't understand. A man addressed me in French. He asked if I was a stranger here. The sound of French in the middle of so much gibberish was invigorating. I heard myself say to him, "Oh, you speak French?" "Of course I do." "That's because I'm not from here." "Where are you from?" His French was perfect. I told him my story in a nutshell. If the house of Baghai is in Donobagan, then it's across the river from here. That's what Donobagan means. It shouldn't be difficult to find it unless everybody is dead. Here, everybody knows everybody else. But just don't try to find someone by using his last name. Almost everybody has the same last name. Look, I'll walk you there if you want. I got on my feet and looked at the man. He was slender, a little taller than me, but not older. He was dressed in an oversized shirt and pants that ended in black leather shoes covered by a thin layer of yellow dust. He looked much cleaner than me in my dust-reddened uniform and filthy sneakers. His narrow eyes were almost hidden behind white glasses, and his hair was bushy. Stretching out his hand, he said, "My name is Adriago Lamosa. You are?" "Malidoma. I mean, Patrice Same." It's been so long since I last was here that I can barely remember where my parents live, but I'm sure I can tell my way from the river. We cut through the crowd and took to the road, heading east again. The sight of the mud houses along the road brought back memories. I recognized the chief's headquarters, built like a fortress with its guarded entrances. I also noticed the minaret, crowned at its top with three ostrich eggs, the tallest mud building in town. Mr. Adriago drew me out of my inspection by asking how long I had been away. Oh, about 15 years, I said almost without interest. Oh, so you're one of those who were chosen by God. He snorted. Independence has put an end to all that crap, but your parents must have forgotten you by now. 15 years leaves plenty of time to die. Where did you go to school? I did not like talking about death in the city. There were fewer schools in colonial times than now, but the same is true for opportunities. Why are you coming home? You should have gone right to the city. With your education, you would have found a job. That's what I would have done before coming home for a visit. There's nothing here. You can't expect to like something you never grew up with. I know. I don't know why I came home. It's complicated. I didn't know how to respond. He had no idea that jobs and earning a livelihood were new realities for me. Before he had spoken to me, I had no ambition other than to get home. He had touched upon grave matters. Interrupting my thoughts, he said, "Look, if you get tired of this, please look me up in the city. Ouagadougou is great. With your education, you will find something you like." We had crossed the river Guadazin and entered Dono Bagan, Dono across the river. It was the same as I remembered it, except for some minor changes, such as trees being cut down here and there. One of the missing trees was the one under which my mother had given birth to me. The road through the village wound from creek to creek as it made its way to my parents' house. After hesitating at a couple of turns, we finally found it. Mr. Adriago did not want to continue to the house. He said he did not like emotional scenes. I sat on a pile of boards under a neem tree, the only shade tree near the house. The home I had left a decade and a half ago faced me silently. No one was in sight. Some chickens hunted for food in the nearby cornfield. 15 years of absence had changed my perception of Earth homes. The compound did not have the same majesty. It did not look tall and imposing, and its simplicity was almost synonymous with desolation. Unconsciously, I was looking at it with eyes that had been changed. Minor additions and modifications had been made. I noticed that the main entrance led directly into the inner yard, whereas 15 years ago, it had led first through the poultry room, then through the zangala, and then into the yard. I wanted to go inside to take a closer look, but something prevented me. The sun had nearly set, and I knew someone was going to come home sooner or later, so I decided to take a nap. When I woke up, the sun had disappeared. There were half a dozen naked people around me, all speaking Dagara, which I could no longer comprehend. They seemed excited by the fact that I had woken up. They were mostly kids and were extremely dirty. Most of them had sores all over their bodies that attracted countless flies. I was as interested in them as they were in me. We could only look at each other. It was not long before a young woman carrying wood appeared from behind the house. She dropped her load near the main entrance and spoke to the children. They responded by pointing at me. She greeted me in French. I asked, "Is this the house of Bakai?" "No, this is a lie, my father's house. Bakai is my grandfather." Her French was miserable, but it was better than the gibberish of the children. I said nothing. She walked inside the compound and came out with a calabash full of white liquid. She drank a small portion of it and handed the rest to me. I brought it to my mouth. It tasted sour, but it was drinkable. She took the rest and walked back into the compound. An old man arrived on a bicycle. He was thin, small, and fragile looking. He parked his bicycle against the wall and greeted me in Dagara. I responded in French. He spoke to the kids around me, looked at me for a while, as if he were trying to identify who I was, then disappeared through the entrance of the compound. Shortly afterward, an older woman arrived. Like the young woman, she had a load of dry wood on her head. She spoke to the kids as she came into sight of us. They, in turn, said something that made her look at me intensely. I wondered why she was staring at me so hard, and I felt ill at ease. As if she were struggling with some decision, she walked forward and backward, continually turning her head toward the river and back to me. I lowered my eyes, picked up a piece of wood, and began moving dirt around. Suddenly, the woman screamed, "Malidoma, pater, Malidoma." She released her grip on her load of dry wood and tilted her head, sending the wood crashing to the ground. Then she rushed toward me. She knelt in front of me, grabbed my hands, and began wailing as if someone had just died. At first, I was embarrassed and turned my face away. Her emotion was so sincere that the tears were rushing out of her eyes like water from a spring. I realized that emotion begets emotion, for I too could not restrain the tears that were welling from my eyes. They blurred the image of my mother as they rushed out, and we wept together silently, her making the sounds of someone in great pain. The noise soon attracted more and more people. The old man reappeared from inside the compound, followed by the young woman who had brought the refreshment. My mother called my name again and cried more than ever. I noticed that the young woman was also in tears, but the old man was not. I read embarrassment in his face. He looked stunned, disoriented, and distressed. My sister ran over to us, cut through the ever-increasing crowd, and joined my mother and me. She made loud cries, and her plump body swung to and fro as she ran her hands up and down my body. My mood turned to embarrassment. My tears dried up, and I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. The women cried much longer. They seemed unwilling to put an end to the electric impulse that had taken hold of them when they recognized me. I noticed that my father had disappeared into the inner yard again and returned with some ash in his left hand. He walked into the sacred room, where he remained for some time. When he reappeared, Mother almost forced me to my feet. She pointed a finger at Father. He stood still while she spoke to him in Dagara. When she was finished, Father said something and walked into the compound. Mother motioned me toward the entrance of the compound. She was holding on to me as if I were a sick person who could not walk, and I gave in to her fancy. My sister held me from the opposite side. Thus, sandwiched between women, I entered the house the Jesuit priest had taken me away from some 15 years ago. I was followed by a crowd eager to drink in every moment of my homecoming. They seated me on a three-legged wooden stool placed against the wall next to an entrance. The sun had set. Darkness was rapidly enveloping the compound. I suddenly realized that where I was sitting used to be my grandfather's room, but it was no longer there. Outside the door, I could see some of the other buildings in the compound. To my right, there was a large kitchen with a fire burning in a big fireplace. On top of the fire was a large clay pot. Farther right and facing south, I could see the door to the Zangala, the same women's quarter I remembered from my childhood. This was the first thing I noticed that had not changed since I left. The other thing that had not changed was my father's quarter, situated south. Its entrance looked directly toward the Zangala. It was the only entrance in the whole compound that had a wooden door. It was pitch dark now, and I was sleepy. My sister politely asked me to take a bath. I remembered it had been nearly 11 days since my last one in the seminary on the morning of my ill-fated eviction. In the washroom, the bath water was pre-warmed in a large clay pot. There was a local liquid soap made from a mixture of boiled shea butter and potassium. I remembered the process from when I was a child. My mother made soap for her family every fifth day of the week. My bath was refreshing and invigorating, and it woke me up from my drowsiness. Afterward, Mother gave me a piece of cloth to cover my body with and took away my filthy clothes and sneakers. That night, I tasted millet cake once again, the everyday food of the Dagara. As I lay down to sleep on the straw mat spread on a dirt platform, I noticed that this was the same place where, 15 years ago, Grandfather had lain telling me things about my future. And where is he now? I wondered. Thank you for tuning in to the live stream. Please check out our membership options to get access to full audiobooks, members only content, and more. Stay tuned for part 11. Peace, blessings, and much love to you all.